and how we can transition onto using cosmetic Botox injections in our day-to-day ophthalmic practice. I practice in Mumbai and Pune. Mostly my practice is 50% reconstructive and 50% cosmetic. I request everyone not to click photographs or screenshots of this presentation because face photos will be displayed. Although we have permission, but still it is a legal, it has legal implications. Now, before we begin any cosmetic clinic or service in our ophthalmology practice, we should be knowing that there's a huge difference between dealing with routine cataract and ophthalmology patients as compared to cosmetic patients. For cosmetic patients, the demands are different. Sometimes they don't even like to be called as patients. You need to assess the goals of your therapy, the goals what the patient has set, and the goals what you can set for them, and have realistic expectations from the treatment options available, including Botox as well. There are always some red flags present in any patient which you should notice first, and if you find any of these and you think you cannot deal with such patients, you should just say no to this patient or refer them to your closest competitor. Some of the red flag signs which you notice are being a manipulative patient, a patient who doesn't respect your front desk staff, a patient who doesn't respect your counselor, patient who is obsessed pointing out each and every fault which they might have on their face, and a patient who wants to look 30 years younger to what she is. So you need to find these red flags out and screen them out right before you begin treatment. Now, evaluation of a cosmetic patient needs a holistic approach, which Devraj will talk more about in his talk later on. But if this patient comes to you and tells that I need Botox, you cannot do much just with Botox in this patient. You can do to a certain extent, but you need to assess the whole face. You need to look at the skin quality. You need to look at dynamic and static lines, the bony structure, everything, including fluid collection around the eyes. When you are counseling a patient for botulinum toxin injections, you need to use your words with caution. You should avoid words like, I'm going to paralyze your muscles, or I'm going to inject a toxin in your face, you're going to have pain, or we are going to freeze your emotions. But substitute these words with things like, I'm just going to slightly weaken the muscle. Botulinum toxin is a small protein molecule which we inject, which is degradable by the body. There's going to be minimal discomfort, or we are just going to soften your expression. So these are the words which make the patient comfortable and more confident about the doctor. Now, coming to the evaluation of any botulinum toxin patient, you need to first assess the patient at rest, and you need to assess the patient while expressing. So if you look at this young male who's in his early 30s and 40s, you need to assess him both at static expressions as well as dynamic expressions. After the assessment is done, so suppose when you look at him in this way, you can see that his corrugators are very strong. So in male patients, the corrugators are strong. So you need to adjust the dosage accordingly and formulate a treatment plan whenever you're dealing with such pain. Second assessment that you need to do in the periocular region is the frontalis. Now, frontalis relatively in this in males is a very debatable question, because males have already heavy eyebrows. So you need to approach the frontalis with utmost caution. You don't want to paralyze the eyebrows altogether. But again, the dosage required as compared to a female patient would be much higher as in a male patient as compared to a female patient. The frontalis has to be seen. The assessment of the frontalis involves looking at the muscle as a whole, whether there's a bifid frontalis, whether there's a fusion of the centralis in the center, and whether the patient has a strong lateral component of the frontalis muscle as well. Last but not the least, crow's feet, which a lot of people start getting in their early 30s, has to be assessed with patient in static as well as dynamic position. Now, once you have formulated a treatment plan, next comes to how to get the patient comfortable. So in our practice, we prefer to apply a numbing cream, which is a topical EMLA formulation, either prilocaine with lignocaine, or there are various formulations with phenylephrine as well, which cause vasoconstriction of the superficial vessels and avoid bruising. You apply topical cream in a generous quantity at all the spots, or as a paste all over the injectable area. What I do in addition to this is there is an occlusion tape which you get along with the topical cream, which you can apply for faster diffusion of this product in the dermis and the subdermal area. this helps in additional and added comfort to the patient. So in the areas where this tape can be applied, you should certainly go ahead and apply it. So the frontal area is a very good prominent area where this tape can be applied. First, the patient wait time reduces. Second, the patient comfort improves. So this occlusion tape is very important when you're dealing with cosmetic patients in your practice. Once this is done, you need to choose the type of toxin. Now we have multiple toxins. Initially, it was just botulinum toxin by Allergan, but now we have Xeomin. We had Botogeny for a brief time in between. You have Nabota by Dr. Reddy's, which is a Korean product. You have Dysport. And then you have Stunox by a French company called Gufic. I personally have had experience with Xeomin, Nabota, and Gufic both. We conducted some trials recently for one of the products, and I personally have not found much difference between most of them. Maybe for Xeomin, I think that the dose needs to be increased by 5 to 10%. But other than that, all these toxins are safe enough. There have been efficacy trials. So unless a patient is very anal about using only the Allergan Botox, I offer all the other toxins as well to them. And the charges are considerably different. In means you can for some patients you can give the cheaper product if they cannot afford the Allergan Botox injection. So there's no difference. The reconstitution remains the same except in Dysport. But Dysport is not very freely available. The only advantage that Dysport has over the others is that the efficacy or the duration of onset of action is shorter. So in Dysport, you see the action within 2-3 days after the injection, while in Botox, it takes around 5 to 7 days for the action to set in. Dilution of Botox is very important. Usually we use preservative-free normal saline. You get it in glass vials. It is preferred because you don't want a preservative because it increases the pain at the injection site. Some people also prefer mixing it with sodium bicarb, 1 or 2 drops of sodium bicarb to reduce the pain. Concentration, I prefer 4 units per 0.1 ml, but you can choose to reconstitute it to 2.5 units per 0.1 ml. To achieve a concentration of 4 units per 0.1 ml, you need to inject 2.5 ml of preservative-free normal saline in a 100-unit vial. To get 2.5 units per 0.1 ml, you need to inject 4 cc of normal saline in a 100-unit vial. The big debate is about storage. So obviously we know that it needs to be refrigerated, but for how long? Previous studies showed that it has to be used within 4 to 6 hours of reconstitution, but we have had people and colleagues using it for up to 1 month, even after reconstitution, if stored properly. The efficacy might decrease, but there is no quantitative study to show how much it decreases. But a lot of colleagues have even used it up to 3 months after reconstitution. Luckily, we don't have to keep it for so long. But if at all you have a practice where your patients are more spaced out, then you can keep it safely up to 1 month after reconstitution in the lower section of the refrigerator. There are no special precautions required, although Xeomin is a company which says that you don't need to refrigerate the product apart from the other product. I always have this chart handy for every patient that comes to our clinic so that we can make notes and we can exactly mark which areas are to be injected in what particular dilution, so that the next time the patient comes, you can reassess the patient and then decide whether you need to increase or reduce the dose. And the patient also feels that their treatment is going up on a certain path and a plan. Now, in the periocular region, I'm going to limit my talk to periocular region today because of the time constraints. But in the periocular region, the main muscles that we deal with are the frontalis, the orbicularis oculi, which is a sphincter-like muscle all around the eye, the corrugator supercilii, the depressor, and the procerus, which are the main depressors of the eyebrow. So we need to understand the interplay between the frontalis and the corrugators and the depressors of the eyebrow to understand the brow dynamics, which is very important for an aesthetic eyebrow appearance. Now, first that we come to is dealing with crow's feet or the lateral orbicularis muscle. Now, these crow's feet is usually formed due to the contraction of the lateral part of the orbicularis. You can see that it can vary from person to person. No person has similar appearance of a crow's feet. Some might have very limited up to the orbital rim or beyond. And some people, especially after you age, get a crow's feet which radiates right up to their cheekbones as well. So you need to assess crow's feet dynamically as well as static. And 3 points of injection are usually recommended, but I sometimes go in fan shape fashion and inject 1 centimeter beyond these points as well if the crow's feet are too dynamic. So 3 points of injections. One thing which you need to know is that you're targeting the orbicularis muscle, which is a superficial muscle. So you need to inject just beneath the skin. You need to raise a bleb. And the usual dose range is between 12 to 24 units. You can start with around 8 units per side, 2.5 units at each point, and begin. This is a small video which demonstrates how crow's feet injections are done in a male patient. So you see, the injector is keeping well away from the orbital rim. If you're a beginner, you can even insinuate a finger within the orbital rim or keep a finger as a guard and then inject. Now, this video also shows how the corrugators are injected, but I'll come to that later. But for crow's feet, basically it is 3 points that you need to inject. Now, beware that you need to be very careful about static crow's feet, especially in older females or older males where there is significant brow descent, and the crow's feet are mainly because of static positioning of
In the interest of time, Adit, I request you to quickly wind up.
Yeah. So not all crow's feet can be treated with Botox. Now, coming to the forehead injections, you need to assess the anatomy of the frontalis muscle. The frontalis is the main elevator of the eyebrow, and it interplays with the corrugators and the brow depressors. While injecting the frontalis muscle, you need to stay 1 centimeter above the rim or above the eyebrow to avoid depression of the eyebrow. So if you inject too low into the frontalis, you can cause a depression of the eyebrow, which is not liked by a lot of women. You need to keep the shape of the eyebrow intact, and you should not over inject to avoid frozen look. So if you look at this male, we have injected at these particular points and we have stayed well above 1 centimeter above the eyebrow so as to retain the shape of the eyebrow. There are different patterns of injection which is decided from patient to patient depending on the anatomy of the frontalis muscle, but on an average women require around 10 to 15 units of Botox injection in the frontalis, and men require around 20 to 30 units. There is another technique called as meso Botox or watercolor Botox, as I like to call it, where I dilute the Botox with normal saline further and inject around 0.5 to 1 unit and paint it all across the forehead to get a good appearance. Now, eyebrow and lamellar complex is very important to inject when you're dealing with the brow. If a patient wants just a subtle arch of the eyebrow, you need to inject at these 3 points in the orbicularis muscle. Along with that, you also need to relax the depressors of the eyebrow so that you get a natural appearing shape. If some people have a very prominent depressor supercilii muscle, as seen in Shah Rukh Khan, you need to inject at this point. The belly of the depressor supercilii rise well within the orbital rim. But on an average, you inject around 12 to 16 units of botulinum toxin injection in the procerus and the corrugator muscles to get a good subtle relaxation. Sometimes the corrugator muscle might be very strong and they might have a static line. For these patients, although you can achieve a good result with botulinum toxin, you don't get complete result and you need to inject fillers, which Dr. Kasturi would be talking about. You can also deal with eyelid fold asymmetry with Botox by doing an interplay between the frontalis and the eyebrow muscle. And last but not the least, nowadays we can also treat a mild ptosis with botulinum toxin by relaxing the orbicularis muscle over the pretarsal area. You have to be very careful while doing this because you don't want to cause ptosis. So the dose has to be very guarded. Last but not the least, while injecting eyebrow and the frontalis muscle, you need to be very careful about Spock phenomena, where due to overaction of the lateral portion of the frontalis, the patient can get a quizzical look. This is a point which you need to inject to treat the Spock phenomena correctly. So you need to have a holistic approach while dealing with botulinum toxin injections on the face. And the aim of the injection should be to have varied expressions intact on the patient's face and not make the patient look like this, where they look similar with all possible expressions on the face. Thank you. You should also take an informed consent before. Don't consider Botox as a small procedure. Informed consent very important for every patient at every visit.
Thanks, Adit, for a comprehensive talk. Dr. Kasturi, over to you. I don't think there's anything that I can add which people don't know about Dr. Kasturi. So it's a pleasure and a privilege to have you here at MOS. Madam, please continue. Madam, your mic is muted. Madam, your mic is mute. Yeah.
Can you
now
hear
we
me
can,
now?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can see your slides. Yes.
Okay. So at the outset, I would like to thank Debraj for giving me this wonderful opportunity. It's always such a pleasure catching up with you all. So I'll be speaking about the aesthetic application of dermal fillers, and also thanks to MOS for this wonderful scientific session. So no financial interest. So I'll be basically speaking on injectable dermal fillers, which we all know basically divided into reversible and the irreversible type. And also we can be divided as synthetic and a natural, and the common synthetic being the PMMA, the HOA, and also the polylactic acid. However, basically all of us, all Debraj, Adit, and all present here, we usually prefer the natural source, which is basically the hyaluronic acid. And most commonly used are either the Restylane or the Juvederm that we use in India. So advantage of this filler is that it really gives a wow effect. You get the effect immediately. Like this is some of the glabellar lines you can see just before and after the surgery on the same time, like just 5 minutes after the procedure. And it really gives a wonderful effect. But we being an ophthalmologist, we usually use it more for the tear trough defect, which is usually defined as an oblique fissure like concavity, which separates this palpable part of the orbicularis muscle from the orbital part of the orbicularis muscle. And this is what you see a tear trough ligament, or laterally, which we call the orbitomallear ligament. This is basically a Z-shaped ligament, where medially we call it a tear trough ligament, and a laterally. And this has been documented very well in one of my patients who was having a thickening of the muscle, and when I was evaluating, I could see this beautiful tear trough, and which I'm thinking that I should share with you all. So this tear trough defect can be either a correct tear trough, which is already I have explained the separation of the palpable part of the orbicularis from the orbital part of the orbicularis, or an indirect or a incorrect one, which is basically nothing but a nasojugal fold, which is basically a separation of the orbital part of orbicularis from the levator labii eleganis side. So all this arises because of the change of a positive vector to a negative vector, where you see the malar eminence which recedes, and this malar lines goes much behind the corneal plane, which we call the development of the negative vector, as you can see here. And also because of the changes, which are the visible changes, which we can see in the skin, which has been shown very well in the form of the wrinkles, and also the hidden changes, which usually involves the fat, the ligaments, and also the bone. So when you have a very prominent tear trough, so dermal filler not only fills up this tear trough, but also it takes care of the pigmentation it takes care of the shadowing effect, as I can see. So in such situation, this is a lady which I injected just yesterday, and you can see like this is so wonderful to see the immediate result after injection dermal filler, where the volvella has been injected, and you can see all these bags, and also the pigmentation or shadowing is much less pre and post following the dermal filler injection. So in situation where you have very minimal fat prolapse and also with the pigmentation, it gives a beautiful effect, as you can see in this some of my patients before and after the procedure. And the most important part is the concealment of this fat. You see this fat, this is a month post injection, and you can see the fat is totally concealed, as if you have done a surgery for this patient. So this also not only takes care of the tear trough, but also it takes care of the orbital fat, the fat prolapse, which is seen in many of the patients, and thus it converts this negative vector, which I have already mentioned, into a positive vector, where you can see now the malar eminence like much anterior to the corneal plane. So this is also just immediate after a procedure, cannula treatment that has been done. So not only taking care of the tear trough, the valley, but also it takes care of the heel. And this can be done either by injection technique, as you can see here. Like this is a classical point and a 3-point injection, which we call the TT1, TT2, TT3. What I have already mentioned, the Z pattern of ligament, that is this is your tear trough ligament, this is the orbitomallear ligament, and here you have the cutaneous zygomatic ligament. So I draw a zone between this ligament and try to fill up in this zone, and go deep. When I use a needle, I go deep down into the various term, And the classical 3 points are one in the center and one in the lateral and the middle. See the difference. This side I have injected, this side I have not injected. You can still see the trough here and also the fat here, and then once you inject, you can see the difference on the both the side. So this is what I want to show, that this is not only managing the tear trough, but also it manages the fat, which we see even in very young patients we see. So here, this is another technique of injecting, which instead of using a needle, the same thing, what we do a cannula. You can see here, this is what I draw the zone between the two ligaments and try to place the product within this zone. And even when I use a cannula, what I do, I go in a small droplets. I put a small droplets along the whole of the infraorbital rim. And then you can see the difference, as you can see here, this lady here just before and just after the procedure. I think this is few weeks after the procedure, and you can see, 2 days after the procedure, and you can see the trough along with the pigmentation, it is being relieved following this procedure. So when you have a minimum fat herniation, many people ask me whether we should go for a filler or we should go for a surgery. So what I believe is that if your orbital fat lies behind the plane of the anterior lacrimal crest, so these are the situation where we go for injection dermal filler. But in a very elderly people, and this situation, we do not go for blepharoplasty. So in elderly people like her, you have so much of bags, and when you see that this fat bag lies much anterior to the plane of the anterior lacrimal crest, so these are the situation where we go for the lower lid blepharoplasty, and basically the process of tissue preservation, where the same orbital fat, you release this orbitomallear ligament and transpose this orbital fat down into the SUFI region, where you can form beautiful tree pedicles and then you can transpose it. So, but sometimes what happens when we do a blepharoplasty and when we don't transpose it, what happens post-operative, we not only lead to a loss of hollowing, periorbital hollowing, but also you can see the shadowing being coming back. So these are the situation where we do a post-blepharoplasty augmentation with injection dermal filler. As you can see here, the CK3 point that is in the malar fat point, you inject in the G point, and then you inject with your cannula the 3 points, which I have already mentioned, the TT1, TT2, TT3. And then you see the immediate changes, the pigmentation. This is the just before injection, post-blepharoplasty. Here you can see the pigmentation much less, and also you see the shadowing and the hollowing is much less. So this has become a very common indication for most of us, especially in the early days when we used to do a blepharoplasty and we used to remove all the tree fat bed. And when the patient comes to us years later with changes in the skin and changes loss of the volume, so these are the situation where you need to inject the dermal filler, and where in such situation I usually prefer the cannula, and you can see the amazing result. Like this is the same lady, you can see this whole area has been filled up with the dermal filler, and when she animates, you can see this is before the injection post blepharoplasty. After the injection post blepharoplasty, when she animates also, you do not see the the wrinkles and also the fat loss that is being seen. Another common indication for many of us which we practice are for the lips, which usually gives a good volumization of the lips, which can be done with both the injection technique or the cannula technique. I prefer the cannula because it doesn't lead to any bruise. So most of my lips nowadays I go with the cannula, and also for the full face I usually prefer the cannula. And you can see the wonderful result that is before and after the procedure. And it really gives a very good rejuvenation of the lips and also a good volumization of the lips. As you can see here, the before, after. This is a beautiful volumization if you look to the pillars out here, and also the sharpening of the sharpness of the cupid bore. And this really makes it looks very beautiful, the same lady before and after the procedure. Debraj, like initial, I think Debraj also does lots of nose augmentation, and especially I feel that this is a wonder product for the nose, especially in situation like this, a traumatic situation where you have so much deformity, the whole of the nasal bridge is being lost. In such situation, the filler injection really gives a very nice nose augmentation. An advantage of a nose augmentation with the filler that it lasts pretty long, because the nose hardly, this is the most immobile part of the face, so it lasts approximately 2 to 3 years, and it really makes your nose look so much slim following the filler injection. A mid-face is a very common indication where we inject into the different points of the face, as you can see here. And look, this is her face when she first came to us, a very virgin face. And then you can see her, this is after the second injection. and this is after the third. So once they keep on coming, you can see the ovalization and also the contouring looks much better as she keeps on taking it. Chin and jawline, you can really, this is one of our very renowned people out here in my place. You can say she really wants a very sharp jaw, a very sharp chin, and this is how you can do following a dermal filler. So I'm just showing, ending my presentation with this, a full face filler, where I've already mentioned that we usually divide the face into the three hierarchy, divide into the three parts, and the most important part for us is the periocular region. I think time is over. Or do I have time, Debraj?
Yes, ma'am. You have a couple of minutes left.
Okay, so you can see her, and then this is first the periocular region that we do, then we go for the mid face, and then we go for the lower part of the face, like the jawline. So this is how we do. This is a classical, in the mid face, we have the 5 points, which is the one in the zygomatic arch, then the zygomatic eminence, and the premalar fat pad, then you have the pre-auricular region, which we usually call the CK4 point. So these are the points which we usually go for the lifting of the mid face, as you can see here. And once you're done in the periocular region, you're done with the mid face. Now you do the lower part of the face. So this is where you put a direct injection. In some points, you have to use the needle because you need to reach down deep into the periosteum. So this is the C1 point, which we inject in the chin, and then you can go to C2 point, where you inject in the just above below the lips, and then here these are the side where what we prefer using the cannula in order to make a very good chin and also to give a beautiful jawline. So this nowadays, which I have already mentioned, the advantage of using a cannula is the bruise is much less and also the recovery is much faster. So it is not that it does not have any complication, because this is not a medical, this is not a medication, it is only a device. So there are no set volume or set concentration that needs to be used. So sometimes it can be too much and sometimes it can be too little, and it can land up situation like this, the lumps and bumps, which can be taken care with the hyaluronidase. And so these are some of the patients, and one of the major complication is a vascular complication, which can be formed in the form of the necrosis. But the most dangerous is that blindness. But we have an advantage because in the face we have these angiosomes, and each of these have either the choke anastomosis or the true anastomosis. Advantage of choke is that if you touch this in undergo spasm, so it will lead to only a local complication. But the disadvantage of the true anastomosis, because it will lead to the unrestricted flow and also to the point of the retrograde flow and lead to the blindness. So we should always have the filler cascade with all the medication ready to tackle any of the complication.
Ma'am, I'm sorry, but if you could just quickly wind up.
Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, ma'am. That was fantastic as usual. And every time we listen to you, we discover and learn something, and it's fantastic. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure now to play the video of my close friend, Dr. Akshay Nair. Just one moment, please. Let me just open everything and then play it. Just sharing the screen now. I hope you can all see the screen.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank the Maharashtra Ophthalmic Society for this opportunity to speak at the virtual conference 2021 on blepharoplasty. My talk is divided into two halves, the first half focusing on lower lid blepharoplasty. The most important thing in lower lid blepharoplasty is assessment. By thorough assessment, we are able to figure out who is a good candidate for a blepharoplasty and who is not. Once you have decided that a patient is a good candidate, we then need to finalize what is the ideal route to give optimum result for surgery, whether a transcutaneous route or a transconjunctival route. So typically when a patient presents, they have complaints of lower eyelid bags or boggy swelling or tired looking eyes or any other nomenclature that they call it. If it is true lower lid fat prolapse, the appearance worsens on upgaze. This is because here the superior rectus and levator are contracting. Conversely, the orbicularis and the inferior rectus relaxes, which reduces the muscle tone, allows the fat to bulge through the septum. So when they look down, obviously with the lower lid retractors and inferior rectus tightening, the fat is pushed back in and the appearance improves on down gaze. Now in elderly patients, you get a similar effect where it worsens on up gaze and improves on down gaze. But only thing here is you now see excess skin folds which are seen as redundant wrinkles. This is because of the lower lid laxity and excess skin. A lower lid laxity can be also judged from the fact that there is inferior scleral show, which means that a horizontal tightening or canthal fixation may help these patients. It is important to differentiate lower eyelid fat prolapse from malar mounds, which are fluid-filled bags on the malar prominences and are not amenable to treatment through a transconjunctival blepharoplasty. Now compare these two photos. What we see on the left is lower lid bags which extend along the entire length of the lower eyelid over here. Whereas here, it is focally restricted only to the medial compartment and on the right side, and all you have also is a prominent tear trough hollow. So a good guideline is to draw a mid-pupillary line and to see if the swelling extends on the lateral half of the mid-pupillary line. Now you can see that on the picture on the left it does, whereas on the picture on the right it does not. And as we would expect, the appearance worsens on upgaze. So the patient on the left is a good candidate for a transconjunctival blepharoplasty, which is what she underwent, and the patient on the right may actually get a better outcome through a tear trough hollow filler, which is what she underwent, and you can see the optimal outcome in her case. So a quick video on transconjunctival blepharoplasty. The landmarks are important to know. When you see a patient with such a lower eyelid bulge, you can identify each swelling which corresponds to the fat pads, the medial, the central or the middle, and then the lateral. Now, the fat pad location is important because between the medial and the middle lies an extremely important structure, the inferior oblique, which we must be mindful of not to damage. For surgery, I prefer an infraorbital block followed by local infiltration. My incision is about 3 to 4 millimeters below the lower edge of the tarsus, and then you directly through a retroorbicularis approach reach the septum, and then you're able to open it up directly. Once you visualize the fat pad, gentle teasing of the fat by opening up the small loculi and the septae are important. You can then tease it out like you are seeing it over here. Once the fat prolapses out, inject local anesthetic into it before you resect. Always cauterize the stalk or the base and then cut such that it does not retract back into the orbit and bleed. It's very gentle teasing that is needed and no aggressive large bold cuts required in this area. You can either resect or transpose based on your comfort level or the requirements of the patient. A good maneuver is to gently put pressure on the globe. This causes any fat to prolapse outside through the wound, and that gives you an idea of how much you need to resect more. The wound is then closed with 6-0 vicryl interrupted sutures. A single layer is good enough. So these are some patients who have undergone transconjunctival blepharoplasty. The gentleman on the left had only a lower lid blepharoplasty with fat excision. The gentleman on the right had a lower and upper eyelid blepharoplasty. Again, breaking the myth that it is largely women who want blepharoplasty. We are now seeing that men are equally willing to get cosmetic corrections done for blepharoplasty. This was a patient who underwent a transconjunctival fat transposition rather than an excision. A filler was also offered to him, but he preferred something more long-lasting and permanent. So there we have transposed the fat to completely obviate that swelling. Transcutaneous blepharoplasty is needed in patients who, in addition to fat prolapse, have redundant skin. And it's important to know how much skin needs to be excised without causing lower eyelid retraction. So you do a pinch test. Now, with this much amount of skin being pinched, observe how the lower lid has come down. This indicates that if you excise this much skin, it is likely to cause lower lid retraction. So you need to reassess. And now, with this much amount of skin being excised, a smaller pinch, you can see that the lower eyelid position is maintained with respect to the inferior limbus. So this is a good amount. The next step is, of course, to mark that much area. And in these cases, I prefer to use a blade rather than a radio frequency cautery for the skin incision. Corneal protector with traction sutures are always a good idea because they provide a good taut bed for the incision. Removing the strip of skin and orbicularis can be done with a monopolar radio frequency cautery. And once that is done, the surgery is pretty straightforward. You have direct access to the fat pad. Again, the anatomy is beautifully seen, the medial, the middle, and the lateral fat pads. Inject and then excise. After excision, you might want to again assess the same way, gentle pressure over the globe to see how much fat prolapses, and that gives you an end point to how much fat you want to excise. You don't want to remove intraconal fat in this case, so be a little conservative. And then, of course, the skin is then draped up. This is the maneuver described by Dr. Guy Masri. The skin is draped. You can also add canthal tightening procedures in the same surgery through the same incision. This is the post-operative outcome. Subciliary scars, when done with meticulous closure, leave behind very little remnant. So as you can see in this patient, after 3 weeks, you can barely make out a subciliary scar. Complications are plenty and we need to be very careful. In Indian patients, using a radiofrequency cautery on the subciliary area can leave behind nasty scars, as you can see in this patient. If there is retraction, contraction, or any other scarring that is seen, it is better to intervene early with either corrective surgery or adjuvants like 5-FU and steroids to prevent functional complications later on. Adjuvant procedures, especially in lower lid blepharoplasty, are common. For example, this lady came with lower eyelid fat bags. We did a transconjunctival blepharoplasty with fat excision. Now you can see there is a hill and a valley. There is a bulge and then the tear trough hollow, and then there is dissociation of the lid cheek junction, which is why the cheek is then prominently seen as another hill. So excision of the fat led to a little amount of skeletonization. And here we've gone in and smoothened the lid cheek junction with 0.5 cc of hyaluronic acid gel. The result, compare the before and the after, and you can see a definite stark improvement. Upper eyelid blepharoplasty, again, assessment is important. We need to understand that upper eyelid and upper brow asymmetry is usually acquired, but there may always be some minor discrepancies between the right and the left side, and it is important to recognize these subtle differences preoperatively such that you can equalize them. In women, it's important to know that the eyebrow lies about at least a centimeter above the supraorbital rim, whereas in men, it lies exactly on the supraorbital rim. Make sure you're able to pick up brow ptosis in patients who have it. In this case, if you were to see that there is true brow ptosis, and a blepharoplasty in this case will actually worsen the brow ptosis. Therefore, this was a patient who underwent an endoscopic brow lift. As you can see, the pre-tarsal show has improved and a blepharoplasty was not needed. Superimposition of the bony architecture shows that the brow position has risen to its normal anatomical position. As is for any eyelid position, any eyelid surgery, assess thoroughly the levator function, the amount of motility, and make sure you rule out myasthenia or any other such potentially complicating issue that could be underlying. In blepharoplasty patients, make sure to pick up ptosis early. This is a gentleman who underwent upper eyelid blepharoplasty without simultaneous correction of the ptosis. The result is that the left eye looks improved, the right eye in younger patients, we see blepharochalasis and dermatochalasis seen in older patients as a result of physiological aging. So quickly run through a surgical video. Before that, the most important thing to know is that there has to be a measured approach, literally and figuratively. We need to make sure that there is at least 2 centimeters of residual skin height, lid height, between the edge of the lower edge of the eyebrow and the lid margin. At least 20 millimeters should be left behind in order to avoid post-operative lag of thalamus. In this video, we have a lady who presented with some amount of hooding on both upper eyelids, and she wanted an improved pretarsal slope. Also, there is subtle brow ptosis, which we address at the same sitting. So here, the most important thing is lid crease marking and marking of the wound, of the amount of skin that is going to be excised. Measure to make sure that the lid crease is symmetrical in both eyes and you have adequate skin, at least 20 millimeters from the lower edge of the eyebrow to the lid margin after wound closure, to make sure you avoid lag of thalamus. In this case, local infiltration is adequate, and I prefer to use a radiofrequency cautery to excise the skin and a small thin sliver of orbicularis. This is because the lid crease gets hidden, the scar gets hidden in the lid crease incision, and therefore it does not appear very, very prominent. Once this is done, it's important to spread the wound out, open up the septum such that you are gently able to dissect the amount of fat that you want to. In this case, there was a limited blepharoplasty done because there was not much upper eyelid fat prolapse. In this case, we have also done an internal brow pexy, which starts by dissecting along the suborbicularis plane superiorly. So here we are now dissecting suborbicular. Taking an absorbable suture in a double arm way, you anchor the subbrow fat directly onto the periosteum. By doing this, you are suturing the subbrow fat to the periosteum and creating a subtle lift there. Once this is done, the skin wound can then be closed in layers, orbicularis with 6 or vicryl interrupted sutures, maybe 2 or 3, and then the skin is closed in Prolene continuous fashion. You can see that the postoperative effect is good. The pretarsal show has improved, and there is a subtle lift at the lateral eyebrow. Blepharoplasty surgeries previously done elsewhere, and they want additional corrective procedures. Give full disclosure of the risks. Give them realistic expectations. Show before after photographs of other patients for them to get a true sense of the healing process. Many times all they need is reassurance, and for this they may come multiple times. Most important is that you must photo document at every visit. So therefore, with a thorough assessment, good counseling, and customized management, we all can achieve optimal outcomes of blepharoplasty, be it an upper lid or a lower lid procedure. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you, Akshay. I will now move on to my presentation. Akshay will ask all the questions at the end of this. Just sharing my screen. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, yes. Yeah, Debrush, we can see your screen.
Okay. So at the outset, thank you everyone for inviting us today. And we'll try and keep this to about 10 minutes. So we have a couple of minutes at the end for speaking. A couple of disclosures are in place, and I've been faculty with all of these companies for a decade plus now. And as we know, the OG curve is what we see on young women. And that is basically what determines youth. That is an S-shaped curve, resulting from the concavity in the under eye area, which Akshay so beautifully demonstrated, followed by the convexity of the malar area, and then going downwards. Now, obviously, if we think about facial aging, it's mother gravity being ever so kind, and mother gravity sort of pulling all of us downwards and medially. So if downwards and medial is facial aging, it becomes important to consider upwards and lateral movement as anti-aging. What happens as we age is there are a number of subliminal and clinical factors which are occurring. For instance, the fat is undergoing a redistribution. So initially, when we are younger, there's more superficial fat. So therefore, the face appears plumped up. But as we become deeper and as we become older and older, the deeper fat becomes more, leading to the folds and leading to the development or the loss of fat superficially, leading to lines which develop. Also, what happens is as we continue to age, there is also a change in the bony vasculature. And essentially what is happening is that the bed or the bony structure is becoming smaller and smaller, while the soft tissues are becoming more and more. So essentially, aging is a process, we believe, by which the bed sheet is becoming more for the bed, leading to all those loss of definition and the increase in folds, etc., that we end up seeing. Now, if you understand that ultimately it's not so much an excess of skin, it's a redistribution which is occurring, you understand why surgery in some cases may be an overkill. However, you need to know surgery, and that's what I'll be discussing in this particular presentation as well. We conducted a study, and this was the first aging study which was conducted on the Indian face. It's a serial photographic documentation study which was conducted by us. And if you look at some of these pictures, you can sort of start to understand how Asian Indians really age. You look at this lady at 23 and you look at her at 71, and you can see how all her facial tissues have slid downwards and medially. And that's continuing to create two sorts of problems: folds in the mid face and hollows in the under eye areas, etc. The upper face, more or less, is relatively well preserved. Again, another lady, and in this lady, you can see how the jawline starts to lose shape, how the cervicomental angle, which used to be very well defined when someone was young, ends up becoming, worse and worse as we age, and that's what aging is all about. Men, of course, not in this particular gentleman, but many men also continue to lose hair as they age, and as they age, that also adds a significant component of aging. In general, what we found out was that the upper third of the face ages very well in Indians, especially because we have melanin in our skin. We have Fitzpatrick type 4 to 5 mainly skin. And so as a result of which the upper third ages very well. It's the real problem is in the mid face and the lower face, especially because anthropological studies have clearly shown that the mandible in the Asian Indian population is not as well developed as the Caucasian population. That is also the reason why we tend to start losing definition and develop double chins more as we age, even though our weight may have otherwise remained the same. When you look at nasolabial fold formation, very simple nasolabial folds which are there, which are grade 1 to 3, you just need a little bit of filler, and we'll be demonstrating that shortly. There are other things which need to be taken care of as well. When a patient comes in to us, they want holistic treatment. They are not interested in our specialty. They are not interested in which residency we got trained at. It's important for us to acquire skills as we go along, because ultimately people want to be treated holistically. For instance, in this 28-year-old, she came in and she wanted to know, her first thing was maybe she has squint in the right eye, which she does not. You can see the light reflects. But you can see that the right side of the face is very different from the left side of the face. And so you can see how there's an inferior scleral show on the right-hand side, which is not there on the left-hand side, and also how the right eyebrow is far higher than the left eyebrow. When she smiles, these changes get more and more accentuated, and you can see that the left eye actually looks smaller, and you can begin to appreciate how subtle inconsistencies or subtle asymmetries can make such a big difference in the way we are viewed or perceived, especially under the high-definition cameras. In this particular patient, instead of going ahead and performing a surgery, we performed a little bit of Botox, a couple of units in the hypertrophic orbicularis oculi, and then a little bit of fillers, which is the Juvederm volbella, which is being used. And then this is how the patient looks after. But more importantly, now when the patient smiles, that asymmetry has been addressed to a large extent. You can see the rest of the face is pretty much the same. It's actually just the way the eyes are behaving, which causes the entire face to look much more symmetric. Go from here to there, and to have the fillers last approximately about 2 years plus, while the Botox has to be repeated every 3 months, is not a bad option, considering that Botox takes less than 10 minutes to perform in the clinic, and it costs possibly a few hundred rupees or 1,000 rupees, as opposed to surgery, which might be more onerous in terms of cost of surgery, as well as the cost of the procedure, in terms of financial cost itself. There are patients who come in for whole face holistic rejuvenation. And this is at a time when basically these patients used to come in with us with only Botox and fillers at our disposal. I'm just trying to demonstrate by doing the botulinum toxin and the fillers. And at that time, we didn't even have the high G prime fillers many years ago. You can actually convert patients from here to here in the space of literally a few minutes. And I think my colleagues before have gone through in detail, so I see no reason to continue on that path. But basically, even if you knew only how to perform botulinum toxin and fillers well, you didn't do threads, you didn't do surgery, you could still possibly give good results to about 50% of your patients. And that's the good thing. That's why you should learn this. Now, in a light face, if you have a nasolabial fold, just using a mild low G prime filler and coating this particular fold can cause this fold to get hydrated and look far better, because this is a filler which will also a hyalocross filler which will absorb water as we go along. This fold will look much better in a few weeks' time. Then there are some people who have very heavy faces. And in this Middle Eastern lady, having this heavy fold means that the mountain has come down. And so until the mountain is taken up, the valley cannot be made better. Just don't stick a needle and try to fill it up. Try to figure out a way using either threads or using a high G prime filler, as we used in this particular case, on the lateral aspect of the face to get the mountain to move up. And once the mountain moves up, you can use a lower G prime filler in order to target the valley. So therefore, it's a creative use of two types of fillers, which some of our colleagues are now also calling a G prime lift or a G facelift. Facial thread lifts are very important, and facial thread lifts are an important way of making sure that the patient can appear years younger. There's an outpatient procedure which is done in the doctor's clinic. Threads have barbed wires around them. These are all absorbable threads, and it's like a rose stem which is going and engaging the facial fat and causing it to get lifted up. Results last 2 years plus, can be done only with prilocaine. So in heavy faces like this, using the threads to lift that particular part of the face and then using fillers to fill up the valley is a good result. And this is a patient who also had a fractional CO2 laser, and you can see the scab sort of falling off. Now, changing the contour of the face using a high G prime filler, a low G prime filler, and threads means that the entire shape of the face can be changed. And this in turn leads to people being viewed completely differently. You can see how this lady looks a lot more elegant, graceful, and probably a little bit more feminine as well because of the usage of the procedures. Knowing surgery is important, and the mid-face lift is one of our favorite procedures, especially in Asian Indian faces which don't age as badly. Use the intraoral route and use the 2-0 proline sutures, which are then which are used to be taken through the malar fat pads. And then at this moment in time, the suture has been threaded up above the zygomatic arch and through an incision which is behind the hairline. And the moment you do that, you see that the left malar area appears higher than the right malar area. That's the sort of traction that you get. This is really a workhorse facelift. We literally don't perform the facelift nowadays, full facelift, because this gives such great results. Then tie this on top of the deep temporal fascia, and the results that you get will last a couple of years, which can further be augmented in terms of a number of procedures by doing the carbon dioxide laser resurfacing. So in general, you could take patients from here to here by performing the blepharoplasties, by performing the mid-face lifts and the CO2 lasers, or from here to there, and make sure that patients look much more rejuvenated and younger. The facial liposuction is something that we perform very regularly, and that means taking fat from the lower, heavier parts of the face and draping or putting that face in the upper parts of the face. And when you do that, you can actually change the facial shape significantly. And if you know all of these techniques, you can sort of transform faces like the one that we've transformed. Please note how the patient looks much younger, but also looks much more aesthetic and doesn't look done. And that's where we need to leave our patients, where they don't look done. In the interest of time, I'm just going to stop the rest and open it up for discussions. There's a lot of rhinoplasty stuff, etc., nasal threads that we end up doing. And I think that, there's only so much that can be spoken about in a short time. So I thank you for your kind attention and a very patient hearing. And if there are any questions, all of us would be happy to take them and take it from there. Thank you very much. Sorry, that's a really long presentation, isn't it? Dr. Kasturi, ma'am, I think Sumit is also here. Hi, Sumit. So good to see you. If there are any questions or anything that we like to discuss, we just have a couple of minutes. We were all a little bit over. So we have about 3 to 4 minutes. Is there anything specific that we would like to discuss? Sumit, thanks for having us here. Thanks for organizing all of this. And thanks for being on the panel as well. Please, if there are any questions that you note which have been sent across, you may please send them here. And open the floor up and over to Dr. Kasturi first, followed by maybe 30 seconds of inputs from all the other speakers before we conclude.
This is an excellent session and you have covered all the topics very well, and right from very basic techniques of botulinum toxin injection, Amit has shown very nicely that what are the indications and contraindications, and we have covered fillers, the surgeries. Akshay has shown beautiful videos, and Debraj, you are always one of the awesome speaker, like we all look forward to listen to you. So I don't have much to add to anything, but one thing which is very interesting, I feel that being an oculoplasty surgeon, our domain is right from the forehead to the chin. So we need to take care of every features on the face, and not only the periorbital region, because nowadays we need to take care of the mid face, we need to take care of the lower face, and also we need to take care of the nose. And the nose, which can be managed both by surgical rhinoplasty and also non-surgical. And I feel that non-surgical is also a very minimally invasive technique, and which usually gives amazing result. So congratulations to all the speakers. And Debraj, if you allow me, I need to join the next session.
Absolutely. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Adit, any thoughts from you? Thank you so much, ma'am.
No, I agree that this was a wonderful session. Unfortunately, Saturday morning is a press time for everyone. But I think all the speakers did good justice to whatever was, and we look forward to having more such sessions, especially in general ophthalmology conferences, so that the awareness about the subject and the specialty increases the rise. And I see that after maybe 5 to 10 years, we should be on par with most of the world with this specialty as well, with all the hard work that is being put by everyone in developing this subspecialty in this region.
Absolutely. Adit, it's amazing to see oculoplasty go from oculoplasty to oculofacial and then go on to facial plastic surgery. And I would like to remind everyone, especially all the other next session has already joined, but amongst the people who perform facial plastic and facial cosmetic surgery in the US, 40% come from an ophthalmology background. Let's not forget that. And let's look at the entire face holistically as we develop our subspecialties. Welcome to Dr. Anand Pangarkar. Welcome to Dr. Pankaj Shah, Dr. Prakash Marathe. Thank you once again to Dr. Sumit Lahane and Ragini Madam, Lahane Sir, Dr. Samant, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here, and moving on to the next session.